It was the summer of 1944, and a young man named Waverly Woodson Jr. was bleeding into the sand at Omaha Beach. He had been hit by shrapnel before his landing craft even reached the shore. He treated himself as best he could. Then, for the next 30 hours, he treated hundreds of others, pulling men from the water, performing emergency surgery in the open air, keeping soldiers alive under relentless fire. He was nominated for the Medal of Honor. He never received it. Woodson was black. And what happened to him? That collision of extraordinary courage and institutional denial was not an exception. It was the rule. It was the experience of more than 1 million black Americans who served in World War II and the hundreds of thousands before them in World War I. They fought for a country that would not fully fight for them. They crossed oceans to defend a democracy they were not allowed to fully live in at home. This is their story. To understand it, history has to start not in the 1940s, but in 1917, when the United States entered the First World War. At that moment, black Americans faced a choice that historian Adrienne Lentz Smith described in her landmark work, Freedom Struggles, as one of the defining moral dilemmas of the 20th century. Whether to serve a nation that treated them as second-class citizens in the hope that service itself would change the equation. Many chose to serve. More than 380,000 black Americans were drafted or enlisted into the U.S. Army during World War I. But the military they entered was rigidly segregated, meaning black and white soldiers were kept in entirely separate units by official government policy. This was not just a matter of barracks and mess halls. It was a hierarchy encoded in law, in officer commissions, in equipment allocation, and in the assignments handed down from above. Most black units in WWI were assigned to labor battalions. That meant digging ditches, unloading ships, building roads, the backbreaking, unacknowledged infrastructure work that made the entire war effort possible, but that earned no medals and almost no recognition. The message was clear, even if unspoken. Certain men were considered more suited to carrying the war than fighting it. But some units did fight, and they did so with a distinction that the U.S. military almost buried. The 369th Infantry Regiment, known as the Harlem Hellfighters, served under French command because the American military refused to integrate them into its own fighting structure. France, which had long fielded troops from its African colonies, had no such policy. So the Hellfighters wore American uniforms and fought under the French flag, spending 191 days in frontline combat, longer than any other American unit in the entire war. Not one man was captured. Not 1 inch of ground they held was ever taken by the enemy. France awarded the entire regiment the Croix de Guerre, one of the nation's highest military honors. Corporal Henry Johnson, a former train station porter from Albany, New York, was personally awarded the Croix de Guerre with gold palm after single-handedly fighting off a German raiding party in the dead of night, armed only with a knife and a spent rifle while wounded. France called him a hero. The American government gave him nothing. When Johnson returned home, there was no parade. There was no pension. There was no job waiting. He died in poverty in 1929. What did he return to? A country in the grip of what historians call the Red Summer of 1919, a wave of racial violence that swept through more than 3 dozen American cities in the months after the war ended. Black veterans, some still wearing their uniforms, were attacked in the streets. The uniform that was supposed to signify service and sacrifice meant nothing, or worse, was seen as a provocation. It would have been reasonable for the generation that followed to refuse to serve. And yet, when World War II began, the debate inside Black America was the same one it had been in 1917, only louder. The Pittsburgh Courier, one of the most widely read black newspapers in the country, launched what became known as the Double V campaign in 1942. The 2 V's stood for 2 victories: victory abroad against fascism and victory at home against racism. The slogan became a rallying cry. It named, plainly and publicly, the double war black Americans were being asked to fight. More than 1 million black Americans served in World War II. They served in a military that was still segregated by law until 1948. They trained at separate bases, ate at separate mess halls, and were commanded almost exclusively by white officers. When black soldiers traveled by military transport, they were sometimes required to give up their seats to German prisoners of war, enemy combatants, because the German POWs were white. Let that land for a moment. The men who were fighting to defeat fascism were treated as less than the soldiers of the fascist regime they were fighting against. That was not a rumor. It was documented. It happened repeatedly at train stations and lunch counters and military bus routes across the American South. And yet, the units fought. The 332nd Fighter Group, the Tuskegee Airmen, trained at the segregated Tuskegee Army Airfield in Alabama, flew more than 1,500 combat missions in the European theater, the name given to the air and ground war fought across Europe and North Africa. They escorted heavy bombers on long-range missions over enemy territory and were credited with one of the lowest loss rates of any escort fighter group in the war. Their nickname, the Red Tails, came from the distinctive red paint on the tail fins of their aircraft. Pilots requested them by name. Among them was Benjamin O. Davis Jr., who had been the only black cadet at West Point in his class, silently shunned by his white classmates for 4 years in a tactic known as silencing, where no one spoke to him except in the line of official duty. He graduated, became a colonel, commanded the Tuskegee Airmen in combat, and eventually became the first black general in the United States Air Force. On the ground, the 761st Tank Battalion, nicknamed the Black Panthers, served under General George S. Patton's Third Army during the push across France and into Germany. When they arrived, Patton reportedly told them he did not care about the color of their skin, only about their willingness to fight. They fought for 183 consecutive days. They participated in the Battle of the Bulge, the massive German counteroffensive in the winter of 1944 to 1945 that nearly broke the Allied advance. They helped liberate towns across France, Belgium, and Germany. Private Ernest Hank Jenkins of the 761st later described what it felt like to push deeper into Germany, knowing that the people he was liberating lived under a regime that preached racial hierarchy, while his own country practiced a version of it back home. The absurdity was not lost on him. It was never lost on any of them. This is the counterintuitive truth at the heart of this story. The black soldiers who served in World War I and World War II were not naive about what they were doing. They were not fighting because they believed America was already the country it claimed to be. They were fighting because they believed it could become that country, and that their service would be the proof. Historian Maggie M. Morehouse, in her study of black military experience, argued that black veterans understood their service as a form of leverage. They were not simply sacrificing for a nation, they were building a case. They were investing in a claim that no one could deny forever. The claim took decades to partially redeem. President Truman desegregated the military in 1948, 3 years after the war ended, with Executive Order 9981. The civil rights movement of the 1950s and 1960s was led significantly by veterans, men who had liberated concentration camps in Europe and returned home to find they could not vote in Georgia, could not eat at a lunch counter in Alabama, could not live in certain neighborhoods in Chicago. The experience of the war, of having been trusted with a rifle, a tank, a fighter plane, made the injustice of segregation impossible to silently accept. Medgar Evers, who would become one of the most important civil rights leaders of the 1950s before his assassination in 1963, was a World War II veteran. He had served in Normandy. He came home and had to fight at gunpoint simply to exercise his right to vote in Mississippi. And Waverly Woodson Jr., the medic who held men together on Omaha Beach while bleeding himself, waited more than 70 years for his government to formally recognize what he had done. He died in 2005. A formal push to award him the Medal of Honor was still unresolved at the time of his death. The paperwork caught in the same bureaucratic indifference that had always shadowed black military service. In 1997, a study commissioned by the U.S. Army, conducted by Shaw University, found that systemic racial bias had prevented black soldiers from receiving the Medal of Honor in World War II. 7 men were subsequently awarded the medal by President Clinton. Not one of them was still alive to receive it in person. In 2021, Henry Johnson, the man France called a hero in 1918, was posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor by President Obama. It had taken 93 years. There is a monument to the Harlem Hellfighters in Harlem, on 5th Avenue and 142nd Street. There are museums dedicated to the Tuskegee Airmen. There are streets and schools named for men whose names the country once chose to forget. These are not just acts of recognition. They are acknowledgments of a debt that was always known, and for a very long time, deliberately left unpaid. It was the summer of 1944, and Waverly Woodson Jr. was on a beach in Normandy, keeping men alive. He was fighting two wars at once. He was not fighting them with reluctance. He was fighting them with everything he had, because he understood, perhaps more clearly than anyone, exactly what was at stake in both of them.